Well, I had a great time right here in Foley, Alabama, with a beautiful growing community. And it was really a farming community at that particular time uh, that I got in life, so to speak, in Foley. And I think about the time us boys used to play in the city park right across the street from our store. And the women's club actually planted the trees in the city park in Foley. And us boys would go over there and swing in the trees and jump around, and we had a good time in the park. But then every now and then, one of the ladies that was involved in the installation of the trees would call the city marshal and tell him to get those boys out of the trees. We were breaking the limbs down and so forth. And so at that particular time, the city had one employee, which was Pete Pettigo. And Pete was a very talented gentleman, but he was not married at that time and living out east of town. But he did everything. He fixed the streets or fixed the culverts and was policeman also for the city of Foley. So he's really a man about town, and it was a great leader for a lot of the people in town. But later on, we had a Smith family that lived over on Orange Street, and they picked up the trash and the garbage and fixed the streets, or maybe graded a street by a bulldozer pulling a grader behind it. And that's the way the streets were graded in Foley. But back in those days, there wasn't a paved street in Foley. There were a few sidewalks, but not many streets. And later on, the WPA in the Roosevelt days, and the city got a WPA grant to pave some of the streets and put curbs and sidewalks in certain areas, the more populated areas that way. And August Mueller had the contract to put those concrete streets or curbing in. But we've seen a constant growth in Foley back when it was a farm town, and later on it did get to be a tourist town. But mainly, all the post offices would get their mail like Alberta would pick up their bag of mail for Alberta at the Foley Post Office, and Gulf Shores and Orange Beach would also pick up their mail at the Foley Post Office. Magnolia Springs and Marlow. It sort of circled all that. Boxcure was picked up in Foley. And that made the post office grow and got to be quite an asset. At one time, there was a temptation to move the post office to Gulf Shores. And we had to talk to the postmaster in Mobile, who was the manager of the post office outside of Mobile area. And so then they stopped that and left it in Foley. And today it's a big post office. I was born on the southeast corner of US 98 and Highway 59. My father built that building on the corner where he had his general store for general merchandise, and it was a general store. A lot of people bought their groceries and their to-do list there. And we were living in the second story of the building, and that's where I was born. My father was mayor at that time from 1924 to 28, and in 25 I was born upstairs over the grocery store. later on, he built a house up on Highway 59 about a mile north of Foley. And we moved up there, and I spent my childhood there along with my brothers. It so happened I was one of 8 boys that were born and raised in Foley, as well as all of us graduated from Foley High School. Foley was a high school for South Baldwin County. People from Lillian, Alberta, Summerdale, and Magnolia Springs, Bon Secour, and all the way to Fort Morgan came to high school in Foley. Foley was well recognized as a leading school in South Baldwin County, and today still is. And it so happens right now it's the largest high school in the county, and it's been a great institution. We've had great teachers, and a lot of students went on and went to college from Foley High School, and then came back to Foley to work. And that was one of my objects. I went to Auburn. I wasn't going to go to Auburn at first, and the boys coming home from World War II were all going to Auburn. They talked me into going to Auburn. I didn't want to go, but they talked me into it. And after 4 years at Auburn, I finished school there in '49. Well, when I was in high school in the 11th grade, I was wanting to get in the service. And the draft board, I made 3 trips to Anniston in the Greyhound bus trying to get in the service. But what you wouldn't believe today, at that time, I graduated from school 5 feet tall, 105 pounds. And today, I'm 5'11". I grew 11 inches after I was 19 years old. And I applied for civil service with the government. And they sent me to Memphis, Tennessee when I was in the 11th grade to go to aircraft mechanic school. And I was at Memphis for 3 months studying to be an aircraft mechanic. And then I was sent to Brookley Field in Mobile. And after about 6 months at Brookley Field, I managed to get a job at the Navy Yard at Pensacola, and Pensacola sent me to Barron Field outside of Foley. And I was liking it at Barron Field. I was working on airplanes, quick engine changes. And I got to be a friend of a lieutenant at Barron Field, and he stopped by one day and told me, he said, "Arthur, I need to talk to you." And I was wondering, what the heck does he want to talk to me about? But I said, "I'll be there in a few minutes." And I went in and talked to him. He said, "Sit down." Well, I did, and he said, "I understand you quit school, that you didn't finish school." I said, "Yeah, I love what I'm doing. I like working on airplanes." He said, "Yes, but you need to finish your school." And I says, "Well, let me see if I can work a schedule out." And he said, "I believe I can get you this night clerk's job here if you want to go to school." And so I talked to the principal the next day about attending school. And the principal, Mr. Hal Hadley, encouraged me. He said, "Yes, I believe you should finish school." And so, anyway, we'll just put you on study hall the first period, and you come to school at 9 o'clock in the morning and go to school from 9 to 3 rather from 8 to 3. So my senior year of high school, the day I graduated from school, I'd worked all day at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola. And after that, it, the war in England was over with, and they turned loose us junior. I was a junior aircraft mechanic. So they turned us all loose, and that's when I decided to go to work for Kirchhoff and Company, shipping gladiolas. And so I had a good year's experience shipping gladiolas, not only out of Foley, but out of Fort Myers, Florida, because they knew I knew the market here out of Foley. And so he asked me if I'd go to Fort Myers and ship that crop, and I did. So coming home that summer was when the boys were coming home, and they were all talking about going to college, and they kept saying, I wish you'd go with us. Well, Charlie Ebert and Pat Caldwell and Raymond Rood and Skip Jones from Orange Beach. And we all graduated from Auburn. After that, Cup Jones from Orange Beach, he was industrial management, and he went on to be a vice president of Shell Oil Company and retired from Shell Oil. He's no longer living. And Pat Caldwell was a B-17 pilot. And Raymond Rood was a 29 pilot. And Raymond, incidentally, flew the first B-29 over Tokyo. A lot of folks didn't know that, but he came back to Saipan one day with 2 engines shot out and flew back to Saipan Island where he was stationed, and they'd already crossed his name off the list as being missing in action. But Raymond went back to Auburn then and finished in pharmacy. And then he got killed in a 29 accident in the Korean War in the 50s. In the early 50s, about 52, was when they went in the Korean War. Possibly you went in somewhere along there. When I finished Auburn, I had a degree in ag science. And at that time, they were having night classes for the local farmers that were in the service for agriculture training. And 2 nights a week, I taught classes in Robertsdale. And at the same time, my father was in the insurance. He had sold his store and was in the insurance business and was doing fairly well in the insurance business. And I was ready to quit. I didn't think I was making much money out of it. And my father talked me out of it. He said, you don't need to quit. You're doing good what you're doing. I said, I don't see how you figure that. I'm not putting any money in my pocket. And it doesn't look like I'm making very, very good headway in the insurance business. And he encouraged me to go talk to Charlie Payne, who was the regional vice president for State Farm Insurance over Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And I had met Charlie Payne down when he was visiting my father. And so that's about all I knew about him. I knew who he was, and he knew who I was. I'd take him fishing or hunting or something. And so I decided, well, I'll go to Birmingham and talk to Charlie Payne about being a State Farm agent. So in the fall of '49, I went to State Farm, and I was walking down the hall. I asked the receptionist where his office was, and she told me right down that hall there. So I started walking down the hall towards his office, and here comes Charlie Payne towards me. He looked up at me. He said, "Boy, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, my father told me to come up and talk to you about writing insurance." He, he said, "Your daddy told you that?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Well, come back in, let's talk a little bit." So we went back to his office and talked probably an hour. And he says, "Well, it's lunchtime. Let's go eat lunch." So we went and ate lunch, went back to the office, and he says, I've got to go back to the supply room. So I followed him back to the supply room, and he proceeded to fill a brand new briefcase with all kinds of papers and all. He says, "I think I got everything I need." So I followed him back up to his office, and I said, well, Mr. Charlie, I guess I better get back to Foley." He said, "Well," he said, "I think I got what you need here. I got you a briefcase." And he hadn't told me what all that meant in that briefcase, but he handed me a new briefcase, which I still have, with all the different sales items in there about it. I learned it from my father. And I ended up spent 47 years with State Farm as an agent. And he tried to get me to go to Birmingham one time and be a manager. And I told him no, I couldn't do that because all I'd have in mind was coming back to Foley. And so later on, I guess it was a year later, he was in the office here in Foley and talking to me. And he said, "Well, I got to ride to Pensacola and see Mr. Fleming. So come on, you can ride to Pensacola with me." So I went to Pensacola, and we went up in the San Carlos Hotel, and I met Mr. Fleming, and he was the regional vice president of State Farm for the state of Florida. And we had a good conversation sitting in his room talking. And finally, Charlie said, "This is the guy I've been telling you about." And they wanted me to move to Pensacola and be manager of Pensacola. And I told him, no, I was going back to Foley. I'm going to stay in Foley. So, and it turned out to be a real successful business for me and my father. And later on, my daughter graduated from Auburn, and then Frances, and so she went to work for me in the State Farm. And well, she was writing more business than I was, but I was getting credit for it. And incidentally, we were the only company, Baldwin Mutual Insurance Company, the only company that State Farm would allow their agents to be licensed by in the United States. And today, it so happens State Farm's the 13th largest institution in the United States. A lot of people don't know that. It's not public knowledge because it's a mutual company. There's no stock in State Farm. It's all owned by the policyholders. Everything you buy a membership, and then one membership for each unit up to 5 units is what you did. But they have been a real success story, and they were successful for Baldwin Mutual too, by us being allowed to license their agents. And we had 300 of their agents licensed in Alabama at one time. But I traveled a lot over the world, you might say, because of production in my agency. They'd have travel trips for us and conventions in other countries. And I got to see a lot of Europe. I got to go to Maui 3 times, and I never did go to Honolulu. I've been over 3 of the islands in Hawaii, but I've never been to Honolulu. But I've been in Mexico and everywhere and all out west I've been at. different trips they had that I had earned in the West. But the nice part about it, I got to see other parts of the world and what was happening in other communities. And I was able, I spent 20 years as a councilman on the Foley City Council. I was first elected in 1952, and I continued on to 1972. And at that time, I ran for mayor and got beat. Mr. Brannon beat me. He was running for mayor at that time. And he got 10 more votes than I did. And he was the mayor, but I told him I was going to run again, and I was going to beat him. I knew I had to see people. And Mr. Brannon was a highly respected representative and former senator representing Baldwin County in the state government. But in '76, I was elected mayor of Foley. And I've seen Foley grow from nothing to what it is today. And right now, it's considered to be over 25,000 people in Foley right now. So Foley, after I got out of it, Tim Russell was elected mayor of Foley, and he succeeded me. And he made great growth in it for 10 years before the governor hired him as finance director for the state of Alabama. Well, anyway, when I was on the city council, I had the project of building an airport for the city of Foley. Foley originally owned the west field at Barron Field. The Navy never put any buildings on that section of Barron Field, which was out east of town. Well, all the Navy buildings were on the east side of the street that went into the field. And all the property on the west side, which was some 300 acres, belonged to the city of Foley. But at that time, it was a big industry. A lot of people lived in Foley, and all the people, officers and different folks, were stationed at Barron Field. The commanding officer lived at Magnolia Springs, for instance. But Barron Field was a big contribution to the city. And then it sort of dropped down some after World War II. And when they started slowing things down, and we tried to get it to be the regular base away from Pensacola, but instead they decided to increase the size of Whiting Field at Milton, Florida. And to this day, Whiting is very active in flight training for the Navy. But their headquarters is still the Navy base at Pensacola. But the Navy offered a lot to the city of Foley. Well, that's when we decided the city needed its own airport. And we applied for a permit to build the city of Foley's airport west of town here. And the Navy objected to it. And the city attorney and I went to Atlanta to the 6th Naval District hearing. They said, the Navy said they were there first, they needed it. And I stopped them. I said, wait a minute, you were not there first. The city of Foley was there first. West Field was built by the WPA back right after World War II in the middle 30s. And to my knowledge, there was only one airplane that ever landed out at Barron Field on City of Foley property. And when I objected to it, then they withdrew their withdrawal about giving us a permit, which we did to build the Foley Municipal Airport. And today it's a very active airport, and there's approximately 25, 30 airplanes out there right now at the Foley Airport. In 1979, we had a catastrophe in Baldwin County when we had a hurricane hit Gulf Shores right direct in the middle of it. And there were a lot of properties and motels. I know for a fact of 5 of them that were destroyed at Gulf Shores, 5 motels, and a lot of businesses and property. And at the same time, there was development around Foley. And we were in the midst of building the outlet mall south of Foley. A group out of Pennsylvania at that particular time was very much interested in building the outlet mall. And it floundered for a while, and another group took it over, and then it was resold. And today is one of the best outlet malls around in volume-wise and selling retail items, and brings a big income to the city of Foley, as it is in the city limits of Foley. And then later on, the railroad was up for disposal. And we tried to buy the railroad from WHEP south to the Legion Club in Foley, the railroad property. The railroad had blocked everything on the east side of it, or getting a permit to cross the railroad. You couldn't. We had streets in Foley that the railroad would block them from completing them on the east side. And so we were trying to get the property where the city of Foley had control of where we put our streets across the railroad. Well, we made an appointment with Ray Bass. He was the highway director for the state of Alabama at that particular time. And Mac Roberts, Mac was back to his old job. He was a former highway director for the state of Alabama. And Ray was a director of the Huntsville district, and Mac Roberts was the director of the Tuscaloosa district for the state Alabama Highway Department. And when one governor would go out, the other one would resign and the other one would take his place. And they flip-flopped that position. And we had a meeting set up about getting that piece of property from WHEP South. And I'll never forget Ray looking over at Mac. He said, "Mac, we can't get in the real estate business." And he said, "That just put us in trouble. Every time people want to cross the railroad, that we'd have to meet with them about giving them a permit to cross the railroad between here and Bay Minette." The county was offered that piece of property. The county was in financial trouble at that particular time. And so they turned their option to get the railroad over to the state of Alabama. Well, Ray didn't want to put the state in the railroad business for getting passes. And so I said, well, Ray, incidentally, I knew Ray at Auburn as a student. But I said, Ray, how about the city of Foley getting it? The city of Foley, what in the heck would the city of Foley do? I said, we got use for it. He said, I don't know what you got use for, but he looked at Mac and he said, Mac, that's what we ought to do. Let's just let the city have it, and we'll get rid of our problem. Well, they wrote a letter to the LSNX, I guess it was, in Jacksonville, turning there right over to the city of Foley. So the city attorney and I went to Jacksonville, and we met with the railroad, and we got a hold of the railroad maps, and they were that big around, and started thumbing through them what we were going to get. And when we all got it, then there was a big discussion in city council whether or not we should get involved in that much railroad property. And some of the councilmen didn't think the city ought to own it. And I finally told them. The next day I get a letter from our phone call, really, from the railroad, telling me we couldn't go through with that deal. I said, what do you mean we couldn't go through with it? I thought we had an agreement. He said we did, but it's in the minutes. It's being sold to the state of Alabama, and it'll be 2 months before we have another meeting of the railroad officials. So we had to just sit on that and be quiet, not say anything about it to anybody. And so then they told us the deal was okay, just send them a check. The railroad authority had agreed to sell it to the city of Foley. And there again, one of the councilmen was fussing. He says, I don't know what in the world we want with that. But I said, well, let me just tell y'all something. If the city don't buy it, I'm fixing to. You're fixing to. I said, yeah, that's my intentions. And I said, but the city should buy it. And finally, he said, well, if you're that firm about it, he said, I'll agree to go along in buying it. And we did. When dealing with the railroad, we were talking about a little over 30 miles from the Legion Club to where Dental Ease is in Baymanet. And what I was going to do, you might wonder, we were buying that for $600,000, which I knew what we'd been paying for right-of-ways to put power lines on. And what this would mean, because the city of Foley was actually as far north of Stapleton, where the fire tower is. Riviera Utilities was running a power line all the way to that fire tower. And it meant a lot for territory, additional area for Riviera Utilities to get. And Riviera Utilities is actually owned by the city of Foley. But anyway, we ended up buying the railroad property, and it came out in the newspapers that the city of Foley had purchased the railroad property. And the day after it came out in the newspaper, the mayor of Robertsdale called me up and said, Mayor, is this true what I'm reading in the paper? I said, what are you talking about? He says the city of Foley buying the railroad property. I said, yeah, that's true. He said, right through Robertsdale? I said, that's true, right through Robertsdale. He said, well, y'all damn sure kept it quiet. And I said, we damn sure did. And That's how the city got the property. And then since that time, the governing body has worked a deal through the different cities on the property, but they can't build on the top of any of that railroad property. They can give them right of way to cross it, but if they put a building on it and the city had to run a power line or a water line or a gas line, we'd have the right to do it and just tear the building down. Didn't have to replace the buildings for any of the people that put buildings on it. But it's turned out to be a great asset. And incidentally, the post office, we were in bad need of a post office building. And the lease over where the old post office was, every 3 years kept being renewed. The property owner, and I kept trying to get a interest from the postal department. Well, the local people were satisfied, but we had about half the room we needed for a post office. And so I made a deal with the Postal Service in Atlanta. I had an appointment set up with the people in Atlanta. And there again, the city attorney was with me. And we told them if they'd draw the plans and all, we would build the building to their specifications and design and lease it to them for 20 years and paying it back off for the city of Foley. So they thought that was a great deal. In fact, the matter, it went through by an act of Congress naming the post office after me because I had promoted that deal and they wanted to get other cities to follow a similar deal where they're leasing post offices. And at that time, the Postal Service didn't have the money to build the buildings they needed. And so it was a great deal for the Postal Service and a great deal for the city of Foley. And now today, that building belongs lock, stock, and barrel to the city of Foley, and they renew the leases every 5 years. But it's built to their specifications and design. So it's a great asset for the city of Foley. And the city of Foley actually didn't have to put up any of their cash money. The only thing we did, that whole half a block in the city of Foley was part of the railroad land that we got when we purchased the railroad to put the post office building on it. And as you see, it's a busy building today.